Welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Our topic today is fall foliage in Pennsylvania, and with us is Ryan Reed, Natural Resource Program Specialist for the Pennsylvania Department of Natural Resources. Ryan has worked in the Bureau of Forestry for approximately 6 years in the communications section. Prior to working with DCNR, he taught biology and environmental science. Ryan is the editor and lead writer for the Bureau's weekly column, Forest Fridays. And many of you may be familiar with his weekly fall foliage forecast during autumn. Hello, and thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So tell us more about yourself and what you do.
So I work for the DCNR Bureau of Forestry in the communications section, and it's essentially my job to connect the folks of Pennsylvania with our forests and to bring forth some outreach that would allow them to make stronger connections with our forests.
Well, I'm not sure everyone's ready for it, but today's topic is about fall in Pennsylvania. And you're going to share with us folks some science about the changing colors of leaves and some suggestions about where to view those color changes.
That's right. I plan to go through the science and show you some of the best of what our fall colors have to offer.
So Ryan, when you are ready, go ahead and get started.
All right. So this topic is fall foliage in Pennsylvania. Again, my name is Ryan Reed. I work for the Department of Natural Resources, and I am a program specialist in the Bureau of Forestry Communications section. So to get started, I'd like to go through some fall foliage basics. We have one of the longest and most varied fall foliage seasons in the world. And that is because we happen to have our geography located at one of the meeting grounds, if you will, of northern hardwoods and southern oak hickory forest types. So at 41 degrees latitude, we are able to have the conditions that would allow for those types of forests to thrive. I like to go into some northern hardwood standouts. So these are species that we typically would think of giving us awesome fall color, and those include maples. And I think a lot of folks, when they think of a maple tree, they often will think, well, that's just one kind of tree. That's not true. We have an awesome diversity of maples. We have sugar maples, we have red maples, striped maples, and even several more. And they are responsible for bringing a very wide palette of beautiful colors to Pennsylvania. As I mentioned, these are our northern hardwoods, so we do tend to find these species in the northern tier of Pennsylvania. Think places like Potter County, Tioga County, Bradford County. Another northern hardwood standout are the birches. And when I think of birches, I typically think of black or yellow birch, and they will produce a beautiful, vibrant yellow color. Another northern hardwood standout are the aspens, and we're talking about big tooth aspen and quaking aspen. I love quaking aspen because they do exactly what their common name says. They shiver and quake in the wind, and you happen to hit it just right. You can watch those beautiful yellow leaves of the quaking aspens trembling in the wind. It's a really neat experience. Another northern hardwood, excuse me, standout is the American beech. Another one that produces these really vibrant yellows and oranges. And then finally, cherries. We have quite the abundance of cherry trees in the northern hardwood forest, including black cherry and pin cherry, also known as fire cherry. And they also produce a little bit different shade of yellow, a very vibrant yellow. So those are the northern hardwood standouts, but we also have a great component of southern species standouts, and these include the oaks. A lot of folks are familiar with our oaks: red, white, black, scarlet, chestnut, And that's just to name a few. There's roughly, I believe, 3 times that number of species throughout the state, and they produce a great diversity of fall color, all the way from nearly a brown, like a russet color, all the way through the reds, and then even into orange. Another southern species standout are the hickories. And these happen to be one of my personal favorites because I just find them to be so vibrant and their leaves are so big. That includes pignut hickory, which I believe is the most common type of hickory in the state, shagbark hickory, which is another very common one, and mockernut hickory. Another southern species standout is the black gum. They actually will produce color before just about any other deciduous tree in Pennsylvania, and they will be a beautiful orange color. Flowering dogwood is another. It's a very commonly planted landscape tree, and they produce an absolutely astounding dark or deep red color in the fall foliage season. Another southern species standout is yellow poplar, another one of my favorites. They have large, beautiful T-shaped leaves, and they get a vibrant yellow. Sassafras, also not to be outdone. I think sassafras have one of the most vibrant orange colors that you'll see in the fall foliage season. And sassafras tend to be very colonial, so you'll get very large clumps of sassafras, and it'll paint the canvas a super bright orange color if you have a large population of sassafras in an area. So those are the southern species standouts. And when you take the two together, the northern hardwoods and then the southern species, you get an extremely long and varied fall foliage season. So following along with that vein, you'll find that we have two peaks. We have an early northern hardwood peak, which tends to be relegated to the northern tier counties in early October. And then we also have a secondary peak, and that is for the oak hickory forest type, and that usually will will tend to be in late October or even into early November. Occasionally, we can have a simultaneous peak of both forest types, and this results in the most vibrant show throughout Pennsylvania, but this requires very special conditions. So when I say special conditions, you may be wondering, well, okay, well, what might that be? So you have to get a little bit into the science of fall color to understand that. So the fall colors are revealed when chlorophyll breaks down. And so the chlorophyll is the light energy harvesting molecules that you'll find in the leaves. And they're responsible, of course, for producing the green color that we see on the leaves of trees. When the growing season is over, what you'll find is that the chlorophyll begins to break down and photosynthesis stops. The fall colors are the pigments that remain, and those include things like orange from carotenoids, yellow from xanthophylls, and red or purple from anthocyanins. You may wonder, well, what are those pigments for? If chlorophyll, the green one, actually is responsible for harvesting most of the available energy in sunlight, then what do those other pigments do? If you're thinking ahead, you may have guessed that those actually also help the tree to harvest a little bit more energy from other parts of the visible spectrum. Now, going back to that conditions thing that I mentioned, what are the conditions that would bring forth an awesome show of the northern hardwoods versus the southern species? And it really boils down to what are the climatic conditions leading into the season. So when I think of a fall, I think of a normal cool down. I think of those 40-degree nights, maybe the daytime highs in the 50s and 60s. Maybe some of those days it even gets into the upper 30s at night. That's what we think of when we think of a typical fall cool down. And if you get a string of those days together, say maybe a week or so, or stretching even beyond that, maybe into 2 weeks, what you'll find is that it spurs all species to begin that process of losing the green and revealing those vibrant colors beneath. You may be wondering, well, where can I go and see all of this beauty? We are absolutely blessed in Pennsylvania with 17 plus million acres of forest land, and many millions of those forest lands are public. The biggest chunk of that is 2.2 million acres of state forests. And so naturally, I work in the Bureau of Forestry. I'm going to tout the fact that we have 2.2 million acres of forest for you to go explore and see these beautiful colors of our northern hardwoods and our southern species standouts. So where might you find our state forest? Well, of course, we think of the northeastern part of Pennsylvania, the Poconos, places like Pinchot State Forest and Delaware State Forest, places like Lackawanna Lake and the town of Jim Thorpe. Forests surrounding these areas are just absolutely stunning. We have a significant population, of course, in the southeastern part of our state. And those areas fortunately have excellent access with French Creek State Park, Nockamixon, Ridley Creek. Those are great examples of state parks in the region, and they are, as you might imagine, abundantly forested. Moving on to south central Pennsylvania, we have Michaud and Buchanan State Forests. We're talking about, between the two of them, about 170,000 acres of forest lands with crisscrossed with trails and abundant places, roads and so forth to be able to view those fall colors. Moving up through the central part of the state, we're talking about Rothrock and Bald Eagle, Moshannon State Forests. Now we're starting to approach some of the area that we would call the big woods of Pennsylvania. Forests as far as the eye can see. Southwestern Pennsylvania, another major population center. We have Forbes and Glitzen State Forests, and especially along the Laurel Ridge, the Laurel Summit is a destination for fall color. In northwestern Pennsylvania, we have the Allegheny National Forest, which of course, like its name says, that is federal, but it's about 300 plus thousand acres of forest land that is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. You'll also find some state lands up there. Kinzu Skywalk happens to be a fall foliage destination, and that is what you're seeing in this picture. It's on my bucket list. I haven't visited yet, but maybe I'll get to see it this year. In north central Pennsylvania, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the heart of the Pennsylvania wilds, Susquehannock, Tiodotin, Tioga State Forests, places like the Pine Creek Rail Trail. This is the largest concentration of forested area in the state, and it is an absolute must-see. If you want to learn more about where to go to see fall color in Pennsylvania, fortunately, we have a resource developed just for that purpose, and it's called the Fall Foliage Story Map. You can see the URL is maps.dcnr.pa.gov/storymaps/fall foliage. You might also wonder when and where to visit. This is important. I get a lot of phone calls from people out of state wondering when they should come to visit Pennsylvania to see our gorgeous forests. And I always refer them to last year's fall foliage report. You can see this graphic here is from October 20th through October 26th of 2022. And this was what I would declare last year peak week when the majority of the state was ablaze in color. You can see that through the Appalachian Ridge running from Northampton County down through Bedford, Fulton, and Franklin, those areas were still in peak at the time of the forecast and slightly past peak throughout the northern tier and through the Laurel Highlands. If you want to plan a visit to a certain area of the state, I strongly recommend you visit this page and you can bring up the 6 reports from last year and see what stage those areas were in at various times. It makes a great tool for planning for fall foliage tourism. And I strongly encourage you, do not miss the show. This is one of the greatest gifts that we could have in the state. And I don't think many people really are aware that fall foliage only occurs in a few areas throughout the world. We are blessed to have this show every year, and I look at it as a grand finale from our forest that give us so many other things beyond just those colors that you see on the screen.
Ryan, thank you so much for sharing that information. Let's get your camera on and let's get to some questions. So,
Yeah, sounds good.
fantastic. So you mentioned that they're not every place is ideal to, not every state is ideal to view the changing colors. But is there competition from the surrounding states of Pennsylvania for fall foliage?
Well, certainly we have a great reputation, I think, in the United States, in the northeastern part of the United States. You're thinking of places like Vermont and New Hampshire, up in the New England states that are very renowned for their fall color. But I think that maybe they get a little more press than they deserve compared to Pennsylvania because our fall foliage season lasts longer and it's more diverse. When you think of the fall color that you see up there, it's typically relegated to just those northern hardwoods, although there are some southern species, of course, mixed in there. But they don't have the dominance that our southern species standouts do here in Pennsylvania. So when people compare states and they want to know which ones to visit, I would say Pennsylvania could go toe to toe with any of those states in any given year.
Sounds good. Does the size of the forest affect the changing colors of the trees? Do larger forests change at different times than smaller forested areas?
Yeah, so you'll find that the transition into fall color is very local and it's very related to geography. Obviously, with the northern tier, we're talking about a decreasing sun angle as the fall progresses, and so they go through their changes more quickly. And so when you think of early October, that's when you want to be in the northern part of the state. And then late October, if you want a beautiful show, you should be in the southern part of the state. And so the changing of color can be a fairly local thing, but it is predictable and it really is, of course, as I mentioned, based upon those climatic conditions leading up to the fall season and during the fall season.
There's a question about the last slide you showed. What was the location of that? Don't miss the show picture.
Yeah, that's a great question. I get that a lot. That's up in the Bald Eagle State Forest District, and I believe it's actually Bald Eagle State Park. Just in that year was a phenomenal display, and it seems like we get those types of displays about every 3 to 4 years, where everything just seems to be a burst in color, and hopefully that will be the case this year. And you may want to know what are my prognostications for this year. I think it's going to be a fantastic year. Um, the springtime was not very promising, and if you had asked me in May, what do you see happening, I probably wouldn't have been very optimistic. But fortunately, we received a lot of widespread, significant rain throughout June, July, and August, and I feel that that's setting our forest up for another fantastic year.
How much do infestations of non-native species, whether it's insects or plants, affect the changes in fall?
It's a great question. So, as you would imagine, the invasive species can be very deleterious to our fall color. When you think of areas that could be defoliated by spongy moth, formerly known as gypsy moth, Some oak trees won't put out another batch of leaves. Most will, but the leaves oftentimes are smaller, and so the color that you would see, the splashes of color would be diminished. When you think of something like our ashes, which there used to be tens of millions of them across the state, ashes produced a really unique color palette. They're almost like a purplish color, and there's still a lot of ash left. They're just very small. A lot of the seedlings sprouted from those final ashes that were being decimated by the emerald ash borer. And so, unfortunately, invasive insects have quite a negative effect on our forests and certainly affect the fall foliage season. There is one silver lining to that, and that is that where one forest tree tends to falter, it tends to be an advantage of other forest trees. So where one forest canopy of, say, ashes or even some oaks, where they're faltering, then their neighbors oftentimes will step in, things like hickories and maybe maples and stuff like that. Our trees are very they I should say they just take advantage of the available sunlight and space, and so the canopies will grow into those areas. I don't want to minimize the impact, though, of the loss of some of those species, or at least an entire growing season for oak trees, perhaps in a certain area. And it is very concerning, and that's why we have robust programs to address those problems in the forest.
So you mentioned Kinzu was on your bucket list to visit. Any other spots?
Yeah, I have to say that I've never been out to the Laurel Highlands either. There's a place called Mount Davis, which happens to be the highest point in Pennsylvania, and it's definitely a bucket list item for fall foliage enthusiasts.
So thank you everyone for your questions. Ryan, I have one last question for you. And what would you like the audience to remember from today's program?
I think the thing that I most want you all to remember is when you see the fall colors, I almost feel like it should be the forest is talking to you. And that might sound far out, but the forest is saying, notice me, look at me, appreciate my beauty. And when you can do that and you just stop for a moment and you think about it, it also will lead you to think of all the other ways that those trees benefit your lives. Trees clean the air, trees, the root systems filter water, they provide habitat for birds and mammals and many other forms of wildlife. We are the state literally named for trees. Pennsylvania translates to Penn's woods. So when you look at those trees, I want you to remember that Pennsylvania is a forest state, and we are very lucky to be called Penn's Woods.
Very well said. Thank you, Ryan, for being part of this program today.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity. It was my pleasure.
To explore more about this topic, you can visit the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources website. Please join us again for more Learn at Lunchtime programs. Visit the State Museum's website for program information and to sign up.